Good morning, audience. I'm Muhajid Ramadan, and to our listening audience, we thank you for allowing us to tune in with you this morning and take a few moments. I know we're used to hearing me on Police Promoting Unity every Wednesday on KCEP, but we have a special pilot program that we're involved in with KCEP, the Silver Sage Foundation, and some of our pilot and colleagues around the country on interfaith dialogue towards love and tolerance in the 21st century. We say interfaith, but also we want to say not just interfaith, but interfaith and intercultural dialogue and cultural competence. And my two guests this morning, I want to give a background on them and then share a few comments with you all in terms of how we arrived here this morning. We have with us Professor Daniel Skubik, who's professor of law, ethics, and humanities at California Baptist University. He teaches public and private international law, constitutional law, and philosophy, and he holds a master's degree in political science and a doctoral degree in philosophy. Our other discussant this morning and representative this morning is from the Muslim community, is our brother Hakan Yesilova, and he's the editor of the U.S.-based Fountain magazine, in addition with the education in language and political sciences. Mr. Yesilova has been a professional publisher since 1995 with experience in various editorial and marketing positions both in Turkey and the United States. In addition, he's an editor. In his editorial position, he organizes international conferences on themes explored in Fountain magazine, such as media ethics, education, peaceful coexistence, which we're going to discuss, intercultural dialogue, and he writes on civil and society and human rights. Thanks to both of you, Professor Daniel Skubik. Daniel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this morning.
Thank you. And Hakan, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Brother Muhajid. It's very kind of you that you reminded me.
Well, both of you, our subject matter today, interfaith, intercultural dialogue. As you all know, both being here in the United States at this time, we're going through what the world is experiencing with this COVID-19 pandemic. Around the COVID-19 pandemic, it somewhat has exposed us to certain disparities that exist in this country along racial and ethnic lines. And along with that, we've seen demonstrations and protests. We've had a recent election that was very contentious, and even in the transition, we're seeing this continued contentiousness that is occurring. And so we, in Southern Nevada, we're certainly involved through the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada, who's also one of our collaborative partners, along with Silver Sage Foundation and KCEP Radio in this pilot program here this morning, this discussion on interfaith dialogue and cultural competence. So we're constantly here in Southern Nevada looking at how can we maintain the constant engagement around discussion about issues about social justice, about systemic racism, about bias, bigotry, racism, and prejudice to make for a more harmonious society. In that work, we had an opportunity to come in contact with Silver Sage Foundation. The foundation who's involved with Hizmet, is the foundation, the organization that we're going to talk about here in a moment. But from that, we learned that they were involved in the engagement around discourse of interfaith discussion and intercultural discussion, problem resolutions, building educational infrastructures and medical infrastructures, a whole host of things. So Hizmet, meaning volunteer services. Hakan, if you would give us a reflection or a definition of Hizmet and what does it mean, and talk about a little bit of its origin, if you would.
Of course. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity. Hizmet as a word, it's originally an Arabic word, but we Turks back in Turkey use it very often, which basically mean to serve others. And this became to be a very popular name for a social movement that flourished around the Muslim cleric, namely Fethullah Gulen, from 1960s onwards, who had basically propagated the idea of successful education so that we could uproot prejudice and bias towards the other, so that we can better understand the world that we're living in through rigorous scientific education, but which is also in reconciliation with our faith traditions. It's in a way, it was trying to reconcile the secularist, positivistic, scientific progress with the spiritual, peaceful traditions of faith. In the source of his idea was that a human being really needed to be considered as a whole. They're not just biological beings. That is a subject matter of scientific, and that we can only study in the laboratory. No, human is something that is much beyond that.
Right. So we look beyond our religious boundaries, or beyond our ethnic boundaries, even beyond what is just a social concept, our racial boundaries, and embrace each other as human beings as a whole.
That's right, and this is why his idea was to not open schools only in Turkey, where he was born and raised, but also to go abroad and open schools all over the world, especially in those countries where there's much more need and there's more dissension than togetherness. And I think it really served quite a purpose.
Right, and you know, I want to go more into the discussion, in particular about the education, and specifically as we conclude about interfaith, intercultural dialogue. Professor Skubik, you have become aware and have been exposed to the works of the Gulen, sometimes we say institutions, and/or the Gulen movement, but Hizmet. You've been exposed to this, and I saw the YouTube video on yourself, and you seem to, as a Christian scholar and philosopher and a teacher of ethics and law, seem to have been very impressed with the Hizmet movement, its spiritual dimensions, and its impact on improving the quality of life, both spiritually and physically, for human beings.
My wife and I had the privilege of being introduced to Hizmet through one of their organizations here in Southern California, originally called Global Cultural Connections, a marvelous name in itself, but not too long after changed to Pacifica Institute. And through Global Cultural Connections, through Pacifica, we've been able to travel to a number of countries around the world to see just what Hizmet, the service without seeking anything in return, without seeking reward, just seeking to give through the institutions that they've established, and most especially through their schools, elementary, secondary, and college and university institutions that have been established. I might mention that there is a marvelous movie entitled Love is a Verb. Trailers can be found online, like on YouTube, and I would recommend that anyone view it. It focuses on the establishment of these Gulen schools or Hizmet institutions, particularly in conflict settings, where young people are having education denied to them, and these Hizmet folk are moving in to establish education institutions for these young people. And most important, it's not to teach them religion, as Hakan was saying. It's to teach them the sciences, the humanities, how to live as human beings with other human beings in this world, and not according to racial or ethnic or cultural divisions. And they don't just establish these institutions, they model that life as they teach the young people. They teach through their example as well as through their lesson plans. So it is not a matter of simply setting up an institution and letting it go its own way, but they meet the needs of the students on the ground, giving of themselves regularly. So we saw that, we're inspired by that, and strongly recommend this movie to others so that they too can see just what Hizmet's been involved in for so many years.
Well, love is a verb.
Love is a verb. And it is true love, Christian love, Jewish love, Islamic love, Hindu love, wherever love is found within religious traditions, it's not an emotion, it is actively seeking the well-being, the welfare of the other, without regard to reciprocation, without regard to how the other might respond. And so, for example, Jesus says that we should be like our Father in heaven, like God, who sends rain on the just and the unjust, who lets the sun shine and sends the rain on all peoples, and we are to do the same. The great commands to...
So
the great commands to love is to love all.
And so you see Hizmet and the work in the philosophy of Fethullah Gulen as modeling that in this world. Hakan, a question for yourself. We know that we find that Hizmet itself, while it's not just religion, it's about service, there has to be an origin, a progenitor. Share with us some of the scholars that led to forming the thinking of Mr. Gulen that helped him form the idea about Hizmet and his service that has gone internationally. And let me just mention, while we mentioned institutions, as I understand, there are some 2,000 schools in 52 countries in 5 continents that you're involved in educationally. Is there a deeper origin to the emergence of Hizmet dating back before Mr. Gulen? What formed and shaped his thinking?
Yeah, I mean, in 1900s, there was this very important scholar of Turkey, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. He had this huge collection of a book that was called Epistles of Light, or Risale-i Nur, in which he formulated how today's Muslims should, in a way, engage with themselves as well as with the rest of the world, and with this huge scientific progress that is happening around us, and also in a time where many of the Muslim countries were under colonization. Of course, there were many other scholars who reacted differently to these progresses, to these events that were happening in those times. But Bediüzzaman's approach was more on the human being, and for also trying to, in a way, wed the heart with the mind. So that he might make that distinction where the Muslims should not react to the world because of this colonizational invasions, in a way, but through another prism in which they also try to see the other as a human being, as somebody that they could benefit from, as a manifestation of God's power in a more perhaps rationalistic and scientific way, but which Muslims should also claim ownership and be a partners to and contribute to. So in a rather belligerent form of approach to the world, his approach was to rediscover the huge potentials that God gave all of us.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And come to this conclusion that we can live in a world where our Western Europe and America can become our neighbors in a way, that we can live together with them in peaceful coexistence. And Fethullah Gulen was, in a sense, the one who put this formulation into real life practices. And his way to go forward was to open schools in which he could raise a generation of young people who are, in a way, free from past prejudices and look forward to a more a life where they can live together with the other.
Right. So he was actually then a progenitor of what we call interfaith dialogue. You're talking about in the early 1900s. He was advocating for Jews, Christians, Muslims, and even other faith traditions to come together to work around common causes, no matter what nation they were in, no matter what their ethnicity was, no matter what their religion was, to look at the greater human aspects. And so I first heard of a interfaith dialogue from my teacher, Imam Muhajid Ramadan, Rahimahullah alayhi, back in the 1980s. And so I'm thinking this is a profound aspect and concept that brought me into the mainstream of interfaith dialogue here in Southern Nevada and around the country. But we're saying that Saeed Nursi was actually talking about interfaith dialogue in the 30s and the 40s. That is profound in the fact that we've seen so much division among the Abrahamic faiths. Professor Skubik, the ideas and thoughts of Saeed Nursi that were fostered and nurtured by Sheikh Gulen, now implemented this way, producing educational institutions and different things that we're going to talk about, how well does that fit and how much could we benefit from that type of interfaith dialogue and intercultural interaction in America today? How much could that we benefit from it?
I think one of the positive outcomes of real interfaith dialogue, that is where we begin by sitting together and listening closely to one another, that we so often come away, I know my wife and I so often from these interfaith discussions with Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and others, is just how much is shared, but also just how much is encouraging, how we are encouraged in our own faith by listening to the commitment of the faith of others and their expression of that faith. And so when we read someone like Saeed Nursi and we see the work of Gulen and the Hizmet movement, then we too are encouraged. One of the scriptural references, you might say, from the King James is we're made jealous. That is, we look to see what is happening in and through the other, and we say to ourselves, but that too is part of our tradition, and why are we not doing the same? Why can we not work together to accomplish such purposes?
Tell me now, so in terms of, let's consider, Professor Skubik, if we will, the what we call social movement in the country, or movement towards social change. The tools that we're speaking of that have been so instrumental in bringing about the effects that we've seen, not that they brought about a total resolve, are they transferable to the United States here today in America to address the issues around systemic racism, privilege, the issues around subjects of dealing with Black Lives Matter, healthcare issues and the disparities there, the criminal justice system? Are these concepts transferable, both yourself, Professor, and Hakan? Are these ideas and concepts of interfaith and intercultural dialogue transferable to bring about a healing here in America today?
They can be transferred if we want them to. It's not that it can be automatically applied without resolve, without setting mind and heart to it, setting love to it. But yes, they most certainly can. And it's not so much a matter of their being imported from abroad or from other religions or from other institutions, so much as when we see, when we look closely, when we listen closely, we find that, well, that's exactly what we ought to be about from our own tradition. The tools and resources we have within Christianity, within Judaism, within Islam in North America, within Hinduism in North America, within Buddhism in North America, and so many other religious traditions. We all share these commitments. We can all share these tools. We can all indeed work together.
Hakan, when we look at what has spawned in terms of addressing human and social needs within the realm of where we've seen the biggest impact, the Hizmet Institutes itself have been involved in developing banking institutions, television stations, newspaper, journalists and writers foundation, universities, hospitals, educational institutions, dormitories, college and preparatory schools for college, and we mentioned that some 2,000 schools, elementary, middle schools, and high school across 52 countries and 5 continents. There has to be a spirit of charitable giving that is occurring in order to drive an institution and this much contributions to society. We know that in the Islamic Quranic text, an emphasis towards giving to the needy is a high priority that God is given to us as Muslims and emphasizes really to the world. But it seems as though the charity experience is deeply connected to the Turkish culture itself.
Well, that's right. It's in a way a part of both Islamic and, of course, Turkish cultural nuances are there too. But I believe America is a land of fundraising and charity, and we can see in a way I consider myself a newcomer to the States. So what I've observed so far is there's a very rich culture of giving too, mostly organized through perhaps religious organization. But tomorrow is Giving Tuesday Day, right? So I'm receiving a lot of messages for charitable donations for tomorrow. So I can see it's a spirit that is universally present all over the world, but especially in America as well. But what in the story of Hizmet, of course, since Mr. Gulen and many of his friends flourished first from Turkey, he was able to, in a sense, generate resources from philanthropist people. For normally in Islam, when you give 2.5% of your annual wealth, that's the bottom line of your charitable action. That's an obligation for those who can afford it. But what Mr. Gulen did was to really, in a way, make people realize that the need is higher. The need is much higher. That 2.5% is the bottom line. You shouldn't go below that. But in a time in which we live in such a huge crisis and trauma, and where there's always a risk of even a nuclear war, God forbid, that we really need to act fast and build school upon school. And by the way, the number of countries is not 52, it's much beyond that, and probably the figures, I don't know if anybody knows the exact numbers anywhere. But my point is the difference of Mr. Gulen was that he was able to convince people around him that there's a bigger need to raise funds, and so that we can give bursaries to students, that we can open schools in Africa and in Bosnia and in Central Asia and in the Far East. I think that was a huge progress. But the core element that I have experienced myself as somebody who graduated from one of those schools in Istanbul was, of course, much beyond the beauties of the campuses or the buildings. It was much more about the relationships that the teachers were able to build with the families, with the kids, that they could give out their love towards the student, that it was not only an academic experience, but also a life learning experience in which the teachers were more like a guide for a huge lifetime rather than just a few years of academic teaching. So retrospectively, I still hold my teachers so high in my opinion that I still count their names in my prayers. So that was the kind of relationship the schools of Hizmet movement were trying to build, as opposed to just only academically motivated or commercially motivated institutions.
Mm-hmm. If our listeners wanted to find out more information about Hizmet, is there a place you could recommend they could go online? And not only about Hizmet, but the Fountain Magazine, which I'd like for you to comment on, but could you give us some information there?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of publications that we have published to introduce Mr. Gulen and his ideas, and of course, Hizmet movement. There are many websites. There's a website called fgulen.org.com in which you can find all the literature available on him. A very recent book that we published, the first English biography of Mr. Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World by Professor John Paul, a Lutheran reverend in Wisconsin. I think that explains a lot about his life, but also how his message is relevant to our times. And I think it's also a very good introduction to some of the basics of Islamic thought in a way that are relevant to our, again, age. So fountainmagazine.com is another website. It's also available in print. It originated in its Turkish edition in 1970s, but this English edition as a fountain is out since 1993. As I was trying to explain about the schools and how they bring this spirituality together with the rigorous scientific teaching, it is the same thing that happens with the fountain there, where you can find an article on ants or spiders or bees or stars next to an article on our spirituality, our Emerald Hills of the Heart, as Mr. Gulen calls, or another article on interfaith dialogues. In a way, we're trying to approach, again, the human being as a whole, in which we believe we need to benefit not only from those disciplines that we like or that we are academically inclined, or in which we base our academic careers, but also from other disciplines. For a wholesome human being really forms if we can nourish all of those faculties in our hearts and in our minds.
Thank you very much, Hakan. I'm going to come back. I want to have more discussion there. Certainly the Fountain Magazine has been an excellent tool, and I can't really thank enough our local affiliates of Hizmet, the Silver Sage Foundation, because it's through them that we became aware of the Fountain Magazine, and it has been a great tool for inmate populations here in the corrections facility in Southern Nevada and Clark County. And many of the articles that's related to human development and spirituality, and even some of those that are on science, have been very valuable and informative. And quite frankly, it's a great tool for people who are into higher dimensions of thinking and spirituality. Professor Skubik, today in America, a lot of people, our younger generations in particular, are becoming what they call non-religions. They don't identify with any religion. Is the concepts that we see promoted in Hizmet, is it just religion, or does it reach the appetite of those who are more inclined towards spirituality? And how much is this a tool for interfaith dialogue? How much is that a benefit there?
There is, to my best understanding, significant number who are saying, those called the nuns, who identify with no particular historical tradition.
Right.
Don't consider themselves particularly Christian or Roman Catholic or any of the Protestant denominations, have no affiliation or no particular affiliation with any other faith that their parents or grandparents might have been part of or continue to practice. For all that, they still are gravely concerned, gravely interested in, significantly interested in spiritual life. That is, that life which circumscribes, defines, fills out what it means to be human. For that, we share across all of the faith traditions. That is, what does it mean to live this life beyond oneself? Is all there is to this life what I gain for myself? And as they used to say, tongue-in-cheek, he who dies with the most toys wins. The whole point is simply to gather for oneself. Or is there indeed something more? And isn't that something more being part of a larger organization, a larger group? And here I'm not talking about faith traditions. I mean, being part of a beloved community. I mean, being part of humanity. I mean, sharing in the life of others. As I mentioned briefly before, that indeed is the root of love, of being actively concerned for the welfare, the well-being of others. It's not an emotion. It is that desire that others' well-being be addressed in this age, and to the extent that I can be a part of that. And how is it that I can be a part of that? When I am joined with others with that common purpose, that common goal, that common desire, which is the desire of humanity. It's expressed in various traditions somewhat differently, and yet we often find, as we sit and listen to one another talk about opportunities for service, that we're coming back to the same sorts of concepts, the same sorts of words, the same sorts of concerns for community service, for the service of the other, without regard for something specific in return for us. Given that that is so widely shared, it's interfaith dialogue in that sense is easy. What is more difficult is addressing the difficulties within each of the religious traditions where there is some dissent. I'm thinking, for example, of this goes back a few years, but unfortunately is still common today. Martin Luther King Jr. and so many of his speeches during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s would have to say that the most segregated hour of life in the United States was Sunday mornings.
That's right.
That is during worship service. That is when we were most racially divided. That within the Christian tradition. And that's a sad commentary on the Christian tradition, and not just of 50, 60 years ago, but of today. And so there is much healing that needs to take place, much action that needs to occur within the Christian tradition. I speak for my own tradition, within the Christian tradition, and no doubt within others as well. But also what is encouraging is to see how there is a reaching out across traditions. I think of Rabbi and teacher Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched side by side with Martin Luther King, and so many of Christian clergy, priests and pastors who were marching with Martin Luther King Jr. during the 50s and 60s. So while healing is necessary, we can also be encouraged that it can take place.
And so it does require, though, a giving of oneself and moving somewhat out of that comfort zone. What about that, Professor Skubik, in terms of intercultural? Because, you know, we're still grappling with the struggle against systemic racism and white privilege here in America. The African Americans are, including those African Americans who are Muslims. How do we utilize this tool of building towards love and compassion and tolerance? How is that used through interfaith now? Because now we're talking about interreligious there. If the most segregated hour in America was at the time of Dr. King's statement, the church hour, the religious hour on Sundays, have we missed the mark? Are we still missing the mark? And how do we interconnect and use interfaith, intercultural dialogue to bring about that union in this country?
We certainly have missed that mark over and over and over again. Much healing still needs to take place. How do we address Islamophobia? How do we address anti-Semitism? How do we address seeing the other as the other rather than as part of this broader community of which we are all a part? I would encourage those who have any background in the Christian tradition to dredge up those teachings and take seriously Jesus saying, first, of course, the great commandment drawing from Judaism, love God. The second commandment, like to it, love neighbor. And by the way, Jesus goes even further, love the enemy, love your enemies. That is, they may consider you enemy, but you are not to consider yourself an enemy to them, and they are not your enemy. Pray for them. Do good to those, even those who despitefully use you. I would love to see larger numbers of Christians take Jesus seriously and say, yes, we will love neighbor and we will even love enemy. And by doing that, break down some of those barriers that have been established between us. And that's not really our work. I want to emphasize that. What we do in service the consequences are to be left with God, whether they are received, whether they are understood, whether they are accepted. Our job is to act for the well-being, for the welfare of others. That's what love demands. Whether it's accepted, whether the consequences are those consequences that we might approve or desire, are not in our hands, they're in God's hands. Leave them where they belong, in His hands, while we simply are obedient.
So that wonderful saying of Christ, the prophet, peace be upon him, he said, it's easy to love the lovable, but who's going to love the unlovable? And in our process...
And that again... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
And that again is God's work even in us. When we were enemies of God, we're told in the Christian scriptures, when we were enemies of God, God reached out to us in love. He loved us to draw us in. That old poem, we drew a circle to keep God out, He drew a bigger circle to take us in. He loved us and broke down those barriers, that enmity that existed between us. And so He gives us that same love that we might show to others, that He has shown to us, that we might all together give back to Him what He has given to us. And that is that love, that action, that care, that concern as part of the community, as part of the loved community, not individual heroes, but as part of larger movements, part of larger concerns. And this is, again, where interfaith dialogue can be so helpful, because that is where we find others who share such commitments from that same God. For there is but one God who gives such love that we can break down such enmity barriers between us.
Thank you, Professor Skubik. I think so very well put. And I feel you're right next door in California with us, but I feel the passion of your belief in this human kindness as being one, as God is one. Hakan, Islam embodies many of, and including all of the values of Christianity when it comes to love. I think, Professor, that would be called agape love in Christianity then. We're not talking about emotional love or passionate love. We're talking about a godly love. Hakan, does that concept, how do we see that in Islam, and how is this a part of the corporate movement of Hizmet?
Well, I mean, as I was listening to Professor Skubik, who put it so well, I remembered when I had the chance to visit him and his wife, Bernadette, whom I like so much. One day as we were having our coffees outside somewhere and we were about to leave, she asked to pray together, and we held our hands together. And as we prayed, I remember I could not help my tears for... and again, retrospectively speaking, I've been a person who has been saying his prayers since the middle school. And I have had the chance to visit Mecca, and then I've been on Hajj a few times. But when I put all of my prayers on one side, and that little prayer with Bernadette and Daniel, I don't know really which one weighs heavier. The thing is, the sincerity, the true love there was really emanating from him and her in a way that was encompassed all of us there. Again, as I was listening to him, I remembered the hadith from our Prophet ﷺ, who said, you cannot go to heaven if you don't believe. If you don't believe, you're not a believer if you don't love one another. That's also as universal as Mr. Skubik was putting. Without that love element, I think we cannot become a true believers. Again, this really goes back down to how we understand the purpose of being in this life. And we're living in an age in which many people, including ourselves perhaps, are putting us, the we and I, in the center of everything. And that's our, in a way, only criterion to understand the world. I think this is making us and that person and all of us, in a way, victims of our own self-absorption. However, true understanding of self is when you look into a mirror, and the mirror is the other. If we only look upon ourselves, that's just false, wrong navigation, without a true mirror in the greater teaching of somebody out there, which that experience that I had in LA that day with Daniel and Bernadette was that mirror effect, in which I could not help my tears. So I think we definitely need that sort of an engagement where we try to see the other in which we see our own selves. And that really starts especially for Muslims. We're now living in times in which we Muslims also, not only black folks living in this country, are feeling like foreigners. So how am I really going to engage with my neighbors who don't really consider me as a neighbor? Well, I mean, my take on that is, and I think that's what Mr. Gulen is approaching, is to consider everyone as a member of Beni Adam, the children of Adam. Whether they accept Adam or not, they're still the children of Adam. And we hold Adam and Eve with high esteem. Even God ordered angels to bow before Adam, the ancestor of me and my neighbor, right? So in that sense, we have a higher opinion of my neighbor, even if he or she doesn't recognize this truth. So in our tradition, we believe that Karramna Beni Adam, we have ennobled the children of Adam. That's what our tradition is teaching us, whether they accept it or not. Their faces, they reflect in the most beautiful way, perhaps a little veiled, the beautiful names and attributes of God. So, Khalaka Adam ala surati, right? Created in the image of God. So, if we can approach our neighbors, maybe they're white racists or black or Indians or whoever, I think that's where we can start finding some sort of a solution. Then we may move on to finding a solution. So it's rather than firefighting, trying to deal with problems that arise out of our control, we may need to perhaps focus more on the essentials that our faith traditions teach. And love is surely, respecting neighbor is surely there.
Yes, valuing that. And, you know, it's interesting that I was reviewing the book by Thomas Michel, who's a Jesuit priest, and I think probably a staff at the Vatican, and his insights into Risale Nur, that is the Seedbeds of Light by Said Nursi, and how he mentions the cultivation of that love and the benefit that he sees for not only Muslims, but for Jews and Christians, and for actually all faith traditions coming together, because there's one single God that quite frankly, who speaks to all of us in different forms and fashions and has given us different shapes and forms, and said that he made us nation, tribes, and families so that we may la ta'arafu, that we may know one another. And so I'm hearing both of you eloquently voice those type of concerns from traditions itself, but also from the teachings of those within that tradition. Professor Skubik, we're in sometimes what people call a watershed moment in history. Professor Gard Jameson here at UNLV, who's a part of the Interfaith Council, actually the chair of the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada, often mentions the fact that we've seen more change and we've seen more events happen in the first 20 years of this century than we saw in the last 20 or last 40 of the previous century, and that likely we'll see more change in this decade than we've seen even up until 2020. Your thoughts in terms of, is this a renaissance moment, or we're at a stage of change?
This is certainly a time where so much is compressed into a short span. So much that happens around us, so much that seems to be happening to us. And it is easy to feel that we're like bits of gravel in a flowing stream being pushed along, that it's entirely beyond us.
Yes.
And that sort of sense of powerlessness, of lack of control, or more common terminology today, unfortunately, is I feel like I'm a victim. I'm being pressed upon from all sides, and there's no way for me to act. That is both a feeling that is widely shared, and we should acknowledge that. But after acknowledging that, let it go, because it's not the truth. No matter how hard-pressed that we might be, no matter how compressed our circumstances with economic collapse in the midst of a pandemic around the world, in the midst of all that surrounds us, and the racism and the discord and the other who is the enemy pressing in on us, we have actions to take. We have decisions to make. It's not what happens to us. It's the decisions we make, the actions that we decide to take that will determine, I don't want to say our destiny, but that determines our initial response to what's going on around us in this compressed time, and how others have a different opportunity then to respond to us. Mm-hmm. I'm not a victim. I'm able to take action. And what sort of action am I able to take? I'm able to take action on behalf of the other. I'm able to act in love. It doesn't matter how compressed the time may be. I am not a victim, and I don't have to conceive of myself as being a victim, even though, yes, there's a lot out of my control. What is in my control is the decision that I take to act on behalf of the other. This is not about saving my life. That's not what love is. This is about seeking to save the other, to do what I can for the other. When my wife and I had the opportunity to travel with a small Hizmet group, an Interfaith dialogue group, to Cambodia, we had the opportunity of meeting some young people who had come out of Gulen schools, Buddhist and Muslim, and no doubt some nuns. And their greatest commitment at that time, this was just a few years ago, about 10 years ago, at that time when things were so difficult in Cambodia, so compressed and so difficult for them, with economic and social and other concerns and great discrimination against different ethnic groups, their greatest concern was going out into the rural communities where there were so few resources and asking people in those communities, how can we best serve you? What can we do for you? These young people who had next to nothing themselves, who sought to give of themselves to others. And that was so encouraging, and in some ways, I have to admit, so embarrassing. Because when was the last time I said that I was willing to give of myself for the sake of another, even though I was feeling pressed, even though I was feeling without significant resources, even though I felt like that grain of sand being blown around in that current of water in that stream over which I had no control. So to see that among these young people is such an encouragement, and it's also an encouragement, I think, to each of us. Stop considering ourselves as victims. Stop considering ourselves as being overcome by circumstances, and be, in the terms of the Christian scriptures, be overcomers. Yes. That is, being in and guided by God to choose for the other, not for the self.
You know, thank you, Professor Skubik, and I hope that our listening audience who's listening in can see and grasp the concept that you're putting forth, and I appreciate it and value the spiritual eloquence that you provided for us from that perspective, but I think is universal. Hakan, just in our closing moments, there's something very interesting. Mr. Gulen writes a letter to the Pope, and back in, I think, 1998 to the Vatican, and it's, I trust in the beauty found in the makeup of humanity. In there, he makes note that Islam has been a misunderstood religion, and for this, the Muslims are mostly to blame. So I find here Mr. Gulen saying that Muslims have a full responsibility, and the perception that people have of Muslims, a large part of which where Professor Skubik was just speaking of, we tend to see ourselves as victims. Sheikh Gulen doesn't seem to see it that way and sees that we have a responsibility to stand up, that we have our, we have our own laundry to wash. What about that?
Well, it's a good point. He gave the letter when he actually had this presence audience with the Pope, late John Paul II. So I think that was even the day that they stood together and gave photos together, even meant a lot to at least those of us back in Turkey. For it was a huge step again, like for people, for nations like us who defined in a very ultra-nationalistic terms their own identity. So that was a step that went beyond those nationalistic boundaries to bring us to a realization that we're not the only ones in the world, that there is a bigger world. And yes, Muslims are responsible for many of the quote-unquote victimizations they're facing, but that's mainly because of the response that we gave in the past with anger or self-righteousness. Whereas there's a prophetic teaching basically teaches us to make things easy for the world, but we chose to make things harder for everyone. Beshuru wala tuneffiru, that's a very beautiful saying of the Prophet. Give good news. Do not make people hate. Make things easy. Do not make them harder. I mean, that's his message. But we chose the harder side of this balance. So I think that's, in a way, the Muslim responsibility that we find ourselves in today. I'm not, again, undermining other factors that causes this polarization around the world vis-a-vis the Muslims. But what we Muslims really need to take on as a culture and how we really need to engage with others in this new era that we're bumping into is to give good news and make things easy for people. This is perhaps a problem with many faith traditions in which we probably imposed a lot on others so that people now identify themselves irreligious. But if we give them the good news, I'm sure they will come to a reconciliation with us.
I believe that. And Hakan and both Professor Daniel Skubik, thank the both of you. We have one moment left, and I'm going to just use that to thank our listening audience for sitting through the duration of this discussion on interfaith dialogue. We know that we did not have a representative from the Jewish community, but due to some time constraints, we weren't able to. We hope that this is a show that you're going to be hearing as a lively part of KCEP's talk show programs. I hope that these two guests, Professor Skubik and Hakan Yesilova, will then come back and share more discussion around just single subject matter and on this movement, on the need for interfaith and intercultural dialogue for peace and harmony in this country. And with that, we pray that it has reached and touched somebody's heart to think outside of themselves. And as the saying goes, pity those on earth so those in heaven will pity you, and that we can find love, compassion, and pity for one another. Thanks to both of you, our guests, for sitting in. Thank our KCEP for collaborating with us, Silver Sage Foundation, Interfaith Council. Thank you all for listening in, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Peace be unto you. Be well. Have a good day and a good life. I'll talk to you on another edition of Civic Promoting Unity on Wednesday from 9:30 to 10. Thank you all so very much for listening in.